The nun who was buried alive by mistake. History is full of chilling tales, but few are as haunting as the story of the nun who was buried alive by mistake. This terrifying incident, which occurred centuries ago, combines the horrors of medical errors, superstitions, and the frailty of life in a time before modern medicine. A life of devotion. The nun in question, whose name is lost to history, lived in a convent in medieval Europe. Like many women of her time, she dedicated her life to prayer, service, and spiritual devotion. The convent was a peaceful place, surrounded by fields and small villages, where the nuns followed a strict daily routine of work, worship, and study. She was reportedly in good health until she fell seriously ill. Historical accounts describe her symptoms as including extreme pallor, shallow breathing, and a weakened pulse, signs that would later contribute to a horrifying misunderstanding. The mistaken death. In the 12th or 13th century, medical knowledge was rudimentary. Physicians and midwives often had little understanding of faint pulses or shallow respiration, especially in cases of severe illness. When the nun's condition worsened, she was pronounced dead by the convent healer. Preparations for burial began immediately. She was laid in a simple coffin, adorned with her religious habit, and transported to the convent cemetery for interment. Villagers and fellow nuns attended the ceremony, believing they were saying goodbye to a soul that had departed. Signs that something was wrong. Some historical sources suggest that subtle signs of life were present but overlooked. Slight movements of her fingers or eyelids, faint warmth of her skin, occasional shallow breath. Unfortunately, in an era without stethoscopes or modern monitoring, these signs were often misinterpreted as natural post-mortem changes. The burial. The coffin was lowered into the grave and the earth was heaped on top. Some accounts claim that during the funeral, sounds of muffled crying or scratching were noticed, but were dismissed as wind or the movements of animals in the graveyard. Only hours or possibly a full day later did someone realize the horrifying truth. The nun was still alive. How she survived is unknown, but records suggest she may have suffocated quickly or remained trapped until help arrived. Sadly, in most versions of the story, she did not survive long enough to be rescued, making her burial final and tragic. Causes of mistaken burials in history. Cases like this were not unique. Mistaken burials were a genuine fear in Europe until the 19th century. Factors included limited medical knowledge. Physicians could not reliably detect life in cases of extreme illness, catalepsy, or coma. Superstition and fear of disease. Rapid burial was often encouraged to prevent spread of illness, not occasionally carnage. Lack of observation tools. Instruments to monitor breathing or pulse were primitive or non-existent. Religious practices. Some communities prioritized swift internment for spiritual or ritual reasons. This fear eventually led to inventions like safety coffins with bells, flags, or ventilation tubes, precautions against premature burial. Historical and cultural impact. The story of the nun resonates for several reasons. Human vulnerability. It highlights how fragile life was before modern medicine. Cultural beliefs. Burial rituals and religious practices sometimes contributed to fatal errors. Legacy in literature. Tales of being buried alive influenced Gothic literature and horror stories, inspiring works by Edgar Allan Poe and others. The nun's tragic fate serves as a chilling reminder of the fine line between life and death in historical societies. Modern lessons. Today, we have the tools to accurately determine death, but the story still teaches lessons about the importance of observation and careful verification, how fear and ritual can cloud judgment, the fragility of human life, and the inevitability of error in medical history. Events and variations. Historical accounts of the nun's tragic fate vary, as most were passed down through convent records, local chronicles, and oral tradition.
Some accounts describe the event in vivid detail: muffled sounds from the grave. Several versions claim that faint cries or scratching noises were heard after the coffin was lowered. Villagers and fellow nuns were reportedly disturbed, but assumed it was the wind or small animals in the cemetery. Signs of life ignored. Some chroniclers noted that the nun's fingers twitched or her chest rose slightly, subtle signs of life that were misinterpreted as natural post-mortem changes. Delayed discovery. In a few variations, the grave was partially opened when the nun was discovered to be alive, but she had already succumbed, highlighting the cruel timing of her burial. Why premature burials were common? The nun's story is not an isolated incident. Premature burial was a genuine fear in medieval and early modern Europe due to several factors: catalepsy and coma. Some illnesses could render a person motionless for hours or days. Medieval observers, unfamiliar with such conditions, often assumed death had occurred. Fear of disease. Epidemics like the plague led to rapid burials to prevent contagion, sometimes at the expense of careful verification. Religious customs. Swift interment was often encouraged to honor the soul and prevent spiritual unrest, leaving little time to confirm death. Lack of medical tools. Without stethoscopes or advanced monitoring, detecting a faint pulse or minimal breathing was extremely difficult. As a result, safety measures like waiting periods, burial observation rooms, and even safety coffins with bells, flags, or ventilation tubes were eventually developed in later centuries. Cultural and literary influence. The story of the nun buried alive had a profound influence on European culture. Gothic literature. Premature burial became a recurring theme in horror stories and Gothic novels, inspiring works by Edgar Allan Poe and later horror authors. Artistic depictions, paintings and illustrations of nuns or women in coffins evoke both tragedy and the suspense of death misunderstood. Folklore, tales of burial mistakes circulated widely, often as moral lessons about vigilance, faith, and human fallibility. The nun's story embodies the intersection of faith, superstition, and the limits of human knowledge, making it both horrifying and historically significant. Lessons from the nun's tragic fate. The story of the nun buried alive by mistake is more than a chilling anecdote. It offers several timeless lessons. The fragility of life. In a time without advanced medicine, even small illnesses could be fatal or misinterpreted. The nun's story reminds us how precarious human life once was. The importance of vigilance. Her death highlights the dangers of rushing to conclusions. Careful observation and verification could have saved her, emphasizing the importance of attention to detail, even in life or death matters. Intersection of faith and fear. Medieval communities were guided by deep religious belief, but fear of disease, death, or spiritual unrest sometimes clouded judgment. This story shows how cultural practices, while well-intentioned, could have tragic consequences. Human error is timeless. Mistakes are not new, they transcend eras. Her story resonates because it is a human story, one of error, misunderstanding, and misfortune. Why her story still captivates. Even centuries later, the nun's tale continues to fascinate audiences. Macabre curiosity. Stories of premature burial tap into a universal fear of being trapped or misunderstood in death. Historical insight. It gives a glimpse into medieval life, medicine, and religious practices. Inspiration for art and literature. From Gothic novels to modern horror, her story has inspired countless works exploring mortality, fear, and the unknown. Modern analysis of premature burial cases. The tale of the nun buried alive by mistake is not just folklore. Historians and medical experts have studied similar cases to understand why such tragedies happened. Modern research shows medical limitations. In medieval Europe, physicians had no tools like stethoscopes or heart monitors. A faint pulse or shallow breathing could easily be misunderstood as death. Catalepsy and coma. Some illnesses could render a person motionless for hours or days. Medieval observers, unfamiliar with such conditions, often assumed death had occurred. Fear of disease. Epidemics like the plague led to rapid burials to prevent contagion, sometimes at the expense of careful verification. Religious customs. Swift interment was often encouraged to honor the soul and prevent spiritual unrest, leaving little time to confirm death. Lack of medical tools. Without stethoscopes or advanced monitoring, detecting a faint pulse or minimal breathing was extremely difficult. As a result, safety measures like waiting periods, burial observation rooms, and even safety coffins with bells, flags, or ventilation tubes were eventually developed in later centuries. Cultural and literary influence.
The United States of America is a nation built from many stories of indigenous civilizations, European colonization, revolution, civil war, industrial might, social struggle, and global influence. Its history is marked by ideals of liberty and equality, yet also by contradiction, slavery beside freedom, opportunity beside exclusion, democracy beside violence. Understanding the United States requires tracing how these forces shaped a continent into a modern superpower. Before 1492, Indigenous America. Long before Europeans arrived, North America was home to hundreds of native nations with complex cultures and economies. Diverse civilizations. The Mississippian culture built great cities like Cahokia. The Iroquois forms the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Pueblo peoples engineered adobe towns and irrigation systems in the Southwest. Trade networks. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf, and obsidian from the Rockies moved along vast trade routes. Worldviews. Indigenous societies emphasized kinship with the land, communal responsibility, and spiritual traditions tied to nature. These civilizations were not static. They rose, adapted to climate change, and interacted through diplomacy and conflict. 2. European contact and colonization, 1492 to 1763. The Columbian Exchange. Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas, unleashing exchanges of crops, animals, and diseases. Smallpox and measles devastated native populations, killing millions. Colonial empires. Established St. Augustine, 1565, and missions across the Southwest. French built fur trading networks along the St. Lawrence and Mississippi. English founded Jamestown, 1607, and Plymouth, 1620, later 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. Slavery takes root. By 1619, enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia. Plantation economies based on tobacco, rice, and later cotton tied the colonies to the brutal Atlantic slave trade, shaping racial hierarchies that would endure for centuries. 3. Revolution and nation building, 1763 to 1800. Causes of revolution. After the French and Indian War, Britain taxed the colonies to pay debts. Colonists protested taxation without representation, leading to the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and armed conflict in 1775. Independence. Declaration of Independence 1776, authored largely by Thomas Jefferson, proclaiming natural rights. Revolutionary War. With French aid, American forces won at Yorktown in 1781. Creating a government. Constitution, 1787, established federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances. Bill of Rights, 1791, guaranteed freedoms of speech, religion, and due process. Yet women, native peoples, and the enslaved were excluded from this new democracy. 4. Expansion and division, 1800 to 1860. Westward growth. Louisiana Purchase, 1803, doubled the nation's size. Manifest Destiny. The belief that the U.S. was destined to span the continent justified displacement of native nations through policies like the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Economic transformation. The North industrialized, the South deepened its dependence on slave labor for cotton. Inventions like the cotton gin and railroads reshaped life. Rising tensions. Compromises over whether new states would allow slavery, Missouri 1820, Kansas, Nebraska 1854, failed to calm conflict. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1660 triggered secession. 5. Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 to 1877. The Civil War, Union versus Confederacy, the bloodiest war in American history, over 600,000 dead. Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, turned the war into a fight against slavery. Union victory, 1865, preserved the nation. Reconstruction, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship and voting rights to black men. Backlash produced Jim Crow segregation and racial terror, undermining these gains. 6. Industrial America and Empire, 1877 to 1914. The Gilded Age. Steel, oil, and rail tycoons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, created vast fortunes. Cities swelled with immigrants from Europe and Asia. Social struggles, labor strikes, women's suffrage movements, and populist farmers challenged inequality. Overseas expansion. The Spanish-American War of 1898 brought Puerto Rico, Guam, and influence over Cuba and the Philippines, signaling America's emergence as an imperial power. 7. World Wars and the Great Depression, 1914 to 1945. World War I. The U.S. joined in 1917, tipping the balance for the Allies. Afterwards, it retreated into isolationism. The Great Depression. The 1929 stock market crash caused mass unemployment. Millions lost homes. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal created Social Security, labor protections, and public works, redefining the role of government. World War II. After Pearl Harbor, 1941, the U.S. mobilized vast industry. Defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945, introduced the nuclear age. 8. Cold War and Civil Rights, 1945 to 1975. Global rivalry. The U.S. confronted the Soviet Union through NATO, the Marshall Plan, and wars in Korea and Vietnam. Domestic change. Civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and others ended legal segregation with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. Movements for women's liberation, LGBTQ+ rights, and native sovereignty reshaped society. Crises. Assassinations, Vietnam protests, and Watergate eroded trust in government. 9. From Reagan to the New Millennium, 1975 to 2001. Conservative turn. Ronald Reagan promoted free markets and military buildup. The Cold War ended with the Soviet collapse in 1991. Technological boom. Personal computers and the internet transformed the economy and culture. Persistent issues. Deindustrialization hurt many communities, mass incarceration expanded, and debates over immigration intensified. 10. The 21st century, 2001 to present. War on Terror. The attacks of September 11, 2001 led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and new security policies. Economic and social upheaval. 2008 financial crisis triggered recession and reforms. Election of Barack Obama 2008 symbolized racial progress, while polarization deepened. New challenges. Movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and fights over immigration and voting rights. The COVID-19 pandemic tested institutions. Geopolitical rivalry with China and debates over America's global role continue. Conclusion. An unfinished experiment. The United States has never been a finished project. Its history is a constant argument over the meaning of freedom, who belongs, who holds power, and how ideals match reality. From indigenous nations to a diverse modern society, the American story is one of creativity and conflict, injustice and reform. Understanding that complexity is essential to imagining its future. 11. America after 9/11. Security, War, and Surveillance, 2001 to 2008. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 marked one of the sharpest turning points in U.S. history. Nearly 3,000 people were killed when hijacked planes struck New York and Washington, D.C. The sense of geographical invulnerability that Americans had felt since the Civil War vanished overnight. The War on Terror. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001 to destroy al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban government. In 2003, the Bush administration launched the Iraq War, claiming Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, claims later proven false. These conflicts became America's longest wars, costing trillions of dollars and reshaping the Middle East. Homeland Security State. The Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers. The Department of Homeland Security and the TSA transformed travel and privacy norms. Guantanamo Bay and the use of enhanced interrogation sparked global controversy over human rights. Cultural impact. Fear, patriotism, and anger mixed together. Country music, films, and television reflected themes of heroism and grief, while critics warned that civil liberties were being sacrificed. 12.